Barrett, here we are. Let's talk about Ted Bundy, yeah?
Let's do it.
As everyone is aware, we are doing a series on Ted Bundy, and this is the first of what we think will be 3, maybe more, episodes that will dive into Bundy's formative years, his teenage years, and I believe some or all of his college years. I will leave it to Dr. Kathy Barrett to give us a lot of information, but I'm going to be asking questions and sort of going along with you guys and figuring this out.
Yeah, I've always been drawn to his story. And I think it's because, and Shannon, you can probably agree with this too, is he came off as such a quote unquote, whatever normal means, guy. He was the guy next door. A lot of people found him to be really good looking. He presented like he was educated, articulate, confident, not the type of person that you would suspect to be one of the most notorious serial killers in America.
Yeah, the unassuming.
Very
right?
Unassuming. And so I think there's something about that has always been very fascinating to me, because sometimes we look at other serial killers or other psychopaths like Eileen Wuornos or Charlie Manson, and you look at them and you're like, clearly they're crazy. Just whether it's their hair or their mugshot or the things they say before they die. But Ted Bundy, from the time he was in the press to his very last interview, presented very stoic, other than some crocodile tears at the very end, which we'll get to in another episode. I was always really drawn to that because I think before I get into his childhood, I think a lot of the discussions that we're having nowadays with the school shootings and where is all this violence coming from, and we can't detect it before it happens, and we're blaming a lot of stuff on mental health, and people don't really know where this comes from. And there's this ongoing debate between, does evil really exist, or is everything related to mental health, or how much does environment or upbringing or stress in the womb and all this stuff. So Ted Bundy, I think, is a really interesting one to study, because a lot of people think this man was pure evil. And as we get into him today, at times, I think he's pure evil, but we'll talk about his childhood a little bit right now, and you'll see how a lot of things sort of created this path of destruction for him. And so I don't know how much of it I think is nature and how much of it is nurture. And I think that's just the ongoing psychology debate anyway.
I just wanted to say that very infamous criminals are what can be so fascinating, and what we often don't hear a lot about is where they started and what contributed to the behaviors. And I think that's what's so interesting about this kind of discussion or this kind of research. So
just to give you a real quick, before I get into the childhood, for those of you who don't know as much about Ted Bundy, as I mentioned, he is one of the most notorious serial killers in America, who hit, I think it was at least 5 or 6 states, starting in 1974 is what they believe to be when his killing spree started. Lasted 5 years for what they know, as far as they can track it. And he would admit, by the end, he admitted to 36 killings. However, experts do believe that he murdered over 100 people. 36 is what they found, but they suspect that it was at least triple or close to triple that. But there are a lot of unsolved murders around that time, bodies that were found that replicate. And I'm not sure exactly if he did allude to that as well towards the end, that there were more. I can't remember, and maybe I'll find that out for you guys by the time we get to that point. That's a little introduction to this man. So let's go back to where this all started. Ted was born in 1946. He was born in Burlington, Vermont, little East Coast town. But he was also born in a home for unwed mothers. He was born out of wedlock, and his mother, who defended him to the very end, her name was Eleanor Louise Cowell. They didn't even have the name Bundy yet, which we'll get to, which sort of plays a part in his identity. So he was born out of wedlock. So Eleanor, a little bit about his mom, she came from an abusive home. She was a department store clerk who, when she had found out she was pregnant, was really ostracized. I mean, you're thinking 1946, it's bad now. Imagine what it was then. So she was ostracized by her church, her social circle, when it was found out that she was pregnant. No one asked anything about the pregnancy. It's just, here's this unwed mother, she's pregnant, so she's ostracized. There's a few theories around who Ted's biological father is. So there's a few different theories. So one had been that she had been allegedly seduced by a quote unquote strange man who got her pregnant. Allegedly, So, and I'm not sure if she just didn't feel comfortable speaking out, because one of the theories was that it was her own father that she was raped by her own father. And so then there was also allegedly a sailor by the name of Jack Worthington had raped her. But after looking into military records, there was no record of anyone by that name. We don't know anything about that. And then there's a couple other theories, but those are the two most notable ones. Once we get in, I'm going to talk about his biological grandfather. And so it would not surprise me if Ted was a product of incest and that his mom had been raped. His father was very violent. Starting out from a psychological or nurturing or attachment perspective, Bundy grew up not knowing who his father was. He had no idea who his father was ever. And no one to this day
already you've got an
exactly. So
issue,
no one
right?
even, and to this day, no one knows who he is. So Eleanor Cowell, his mom, was 22 years old and unmarried when she had Theodore. So this really humiliated her deeply religious parents. So mom and dad were very religious. So after giving birth in the unwed mother's home, she came back to her parents in Philadelphia and moved in with them. Ted started off his life as a secret and his mother's greatest shame.
Somebody obviously took it upon themselves to try and figure out who his father was, but then there was just no traction on that. It sort of sounds like it was like all stories and lore. I guess it's the mom, because it was so shameful, she just didn't want to say. So I'm thinking it's even more shameful than what they might think. I think so too. I mean,
Eleanor obviously, I'm assuming, knew who it was and never wanted that to get out. And if it was his father's never going to say anything because, everything is so closeted at that time. So much, I mean, right there, you already have so many layers. And then to add to that, from a psychological perspective, Eleanor's mother had a history of depression. So she could have been completely shut down. And here dad is trying to parentify Eleanor and sort of becoming the woman of the house and potentially using her for his sexual pleasure or whatever, or punishing her, whatever. She often underwent electroconvulsive therapy. Eleanor's father, Simon, the alleged rapist here, was noted to be extremely violent. He was addicted to pornography. And one of the things that came up in a couple different stories that I looked into is he would actually toss his daughters down the stairs if they slept too late. He'd kick the family dog until he howled, screaming sociopathy right there. I mean, the dad just seems very, very violent and completely shut off, and obviously not very nurturing or supportive.
And I hear what you're saying. The obvious piece of this is that violence and that lack of caring for, nurturing for anything. And then I think I wouldn't want to devalue the impact that a depressive mother, we would undervalue that, because a depressive mother would be sort of quiet and unassuming and obviously, from what you're saying, a victim. And I think we might see this as we get into other cases like this. We might see this as a theme because the depressive mother is very difficult to survive in a healthy manner. They can't nurture. They don't want to touch you. They don't pay attention to you. They don't mirror you, all that good, healthy.
Girls are getting abused and mom can't really step up. And it was 1946. A wife's not going to step up to an abusive husband.
Right. And no, there's no antidepressant. We're not.
And if she's getting convulsive therapy, she's probably knocked out for a little bit. So we're painting this picture of a really, really sad home.
A home where someone, a child, all the children, were not being respected. We're not being mirrored, meaning they have an emotion and you validate that emotion is real and okay. A home where they're not being paid attention to at all or given any of that life lessons or how to get things done. I mean, to the simplest things.
And I think this gets amplified even more when Bundy later down the road, and I'll get into Anne Rule and her role in this later, but Ted worked at a crisis hotline in his 20s and he met Anne Rule, who's actually was a crime novelist. She passed away, and she wrote a really, really great book called The Stranger Beside Me that talks about her experience knowing him all the way to his death. He shared with Anne that he identified, respected, and clung to his grandfather. So talk about how modeling and sort of that trauma bonding, all of that stuff plays a part in. He looked at Simon as this powerful, admirable person. So there's a lot right there. Sort of moving forward with this, Eleanor's, embarrassing secret. Because of that, she raised Ted to believe that she was actually his sister and his grandparents were his parents. So now we fucked up his identity twice. So by the age of 10, Ted started suspecting that something was wrong and he was living a lie. He was starting to pick up things that just didn't make any sense. Didn't know anything for sure yet, just sort of kind of compartmentalized that. So he started showing signs that he was unwell and maladjusted around 3 years old, which is really interesting. His Aunt Julia was babysitting him one day, and she was taking a nap. And she woke up to him smiling and standing over her. And he was 3. And some reports say that he was even like giggling. And he had grabbed all the knives from the cutlery drawer in the kitchen and arranged them on her pillow with all the points of the knives pointing down to her face. How a 3-year-old knows how to do that, I don't know.
What did she do?
Freaked out. And she sort of got up. And I mean, what from her report is she was so completely thrown off and terrified, and the more terrified she was, the more satisfaction he appeared to get out of it. So that's where you look at it and you go, 3 years old, wow. That's where I think a lot of people go, is this just pure evil?
What can we say about that isn't about evil? You know what I mean? If it's about child behavior, I think children act out of instinct. So there was an instinct there and you tell me if I'm on the right track, but when I hear that, I hear that a child has an instinct to act out some kind of impulse or instinct that's inherent in them, but that they also have probably witnessed because there was a lot of violence in the home, and that they're trying to understand it. And so they, just like with sexual impulses when in small children, like they're trying to understand what it is and they don't quite know. Right?
And I think that my guess would be the same as yours, is he's seen some version of this at this point, whether it was with a knife or something else. He's been exposed to violence already at this point. Really sad, but also very terrifying at the same time.
Precursor to many horrific acts.
Eleanor, by the urge of a lot of family members, they said, she should leave the house she was living in with her biological mom and dad. And she left and started actually going by her middle name, Louise. So if you do any research on Ted Bundy and his mother's name comes up, it can come up as either Eleanor or Louise. They left Philly. She and Ted left Philly and they moved to Tacoma, Washington. And they had initially moved in with Louise's uncle, Jack, who also sort of plays a positive role in this. But Ted was really devastated to leave his father, who he thought it was his father, his grandfather, Simon. And he had a really difficult time adjusting. And I sort of said this earlier, that he remembers Simon to be a loving father, even though he was completely tyrannical. It speaks to his trauma, his emotional repression. But Jack sort of stepped in and became a father figure. And he was a musician. And he was actually one of the more positive male influences that Ted had. So this is where Louise, or Eleanor, meets a man by the name of John Bundy, and she marries him. He's a hospital cook, and apparently from what I understand, a decent man. But Ted never really felt close to him because, and this is where the grandiosity and potential narcissism starts, is he felt John was inadequate, financially unsuccessful. He was not very bright. He just didn't feel that John was enough. And so John and Louise ended up having more children, but Ted never connected. He was very distant from that. So he started demonstrating this grandiosity and appearing to feel above the law even before he was a teenager. But, we have some like prodromal indicators.
What I hear is you think that was a reaction to the abandonment he felt of not being able to be with who he thought was his parents and who he idolized and his father/grandfather.
I think he started to value who Simon was, that he presented as very powerful. He could scare people. He was very threatening. And then he meets John, who's like probably just a normal, decent human being. And he's like, you're weak. You're pathetic. You're not enough. Right. So he starts from an early age. He values that power, that grandiosity. And so I think he starts to demonstrate those values when his mother meets John, because he vocalizes that.
Right. Like his early mirror was this violent, strong, controlling man. If you're learning how to be a man, if you're learning how to be a person from your parents, that was his mirror. Yep. And so later when the mirror changed, it was like, wait, I don't like this
person is pathetic. They're not threatening. So
Yeah.
so that's sort of the end of the childhood piece, because now we will sort of move into some of his teenage years. This sort of brings us now into his teenage years, where we start to now see, as Shannon was talking about the mirroring and what he valued, we start to now see him start to act this out. So at the age of 15, Bundy, and I apologize, I didn't really clarify this, although most of you probably picked up on this. Obviously, when his mother married John, Ted took on the last name. So he was no longer Theodore Cowell. He became Theodore Bundy, hence the third identity, right?
Issue.
So at 15, he starts showing signs of shoplifting. And he was also a suspect in 2 burglaries at 15. He was also, this becomes a big piece right here. He was also caught peeping into women's windows. Some seem to believe that it was at the age of 15 that he committed his first murder. And I'll explain that in a little bit. They actually don't put this together till like 30 years later. So Bundy was never charged with the murder, but there was an 8-year-old little girl in the neighborhood by the name of Anne Marie Burr. And Burr was actually a piano student of his great uncle Jack, who he and his mom were living with initially before she married John. So Bundy was a newspaper delivery boy at the time of Anne Marie Burr's disappearance. And one morning, the Burr's home had been broken into, and Anne Marie was missing, and her body was never found. When they looked into this, they never suspected Ted at this time because there was really no reason to. But when they had gone back and revisited the crime scene many times, there was no struggle. She would only have left with someone she trusted. And so years later, they determined that Ted and Anne Marie actually knew each other quite well.
Well, and we're in a time period, right, where it's like the early 1960s or late 1950s, where I don't think killers that were 15 were not exactly usual,
and people slept with their doors unlocked. Yeah. Right? And their windows open and all that stuff. So there was no sign of struggle. He knew the house. He knew her. She knew him. And yeah, we weren't looking at 15-year-olds as psychopaths in the 60s and 70s. They were the victims. Burr's neighbor reported seeing someone in their yard peeping into the windows a couple days prior to Anne Marie's disappearance. So like I said, there was no sign of struggle. A decade later, Anne Marie's relatives would tell authorities that Bundy and Anne Marie actually did know each other and were friendly, and that she wouldn't have feared him. There's a big indicator there that he could be a huge suspect in this. But, we didn't have DNA and all that stuff going on at that time. So anyway, by the age of 15, we're seeing evidence pertaining to animal mutilation, violence, acts of sexual deviancy. He started becoming obsessed with fictional detective stories that had graphic sex and violence, where women were actually mistreated. And he would learn in these stories how the perpetrator got away with their crimes. And he became really obsessed with reading these stories and sort of filing away how he could abuse someone and get away with it. So psychologists would describe him as, and I'll talk about his main psychologist when he's in the hospital, but they would describe him as almost bubbling over with aggression, but not yet a predator. So he was sort of working up and gaining that knowledge and filing it away.
Didn't have anywhere to direct it, or he hadn't figured out.
He had a little bit, but not to the extent of murdering, unless he actually did murder Anne Marie, which we don't really know for sure.
Well, it's like any new behavior in someone, right? Even if it's a positive behavior, it's sort of like
absolutely
all over the place when you first start using it.
And at 15, you add like the hormones and all that stuff going on at that time. He's all over.
Yeah.
So this is how, and also probably how he got introduced to sexuality, because let's think about it. If he was probably looking at his grandfather's pornography, now he's looking at this stuff. I don't believe anyone actually sat him down and had a real discussion about healthy sexuality with him. Most of the sex offenders I've evaluated, they learned about sexuality through really deviant ways, and then ended up believing, just a really misconstrued idea of what intimacy is and sexuality.
So when you hear how Bundy was introduced to sexuality through peeping, certainly, so that's his own imagination, basically. And then these detective stories is the other way, right? And so when you hear that, would you say in your experience that that's a common way that predators get introduced to things like that, like with through imagination,
Yeah,
stories,
imagination,
or
association. I mean, we don't, not to get too graphic, but we don't know, did he go home and masturbate to these women? And then there was a cognitive
right?
association with being
Mm-hmm.
deviant, and that was the way he could become aroused. One of the things with that we often assess when we're looking at sex offenders is how they associate their first arousal and what that means about how they can actually become aroused. And if it's through violence or deviancy, they tend to end up playing that out. And another thing is that many of them will do multiple rehearsals before they, meaning in their minds, before they act out. So one of the reasons they're not allowed to look at any pornography, or they have to talk about whatever fantasies they're having when they're either in prison or in treatment, because those rehearsals are really dangerous, because it means that they're preparing to do something again. So it sounds like he had plenty of time to rehearse what he wanted to do and play that out in his mind.
Right. So even if he wasn't murdering at that time, because we don't know, even if he wasn't, he was certainly peeping and
Yes,
rehearsing that he would be murdering or,
absolutely.
assaulting
Yeah.
people.
In the mid 60s now, so we're looking at, he's probably like 16, 17 years old. He was a student at Woodrow Wilson in Tacoma, so they're still in Washington. And he was really noted to be awkward with the girls or any kind of intimacy, which is not a shocker after everything we've just discussed. He only really knew how to fantasize about them from afar. His peers described him as very shy. He didn't date. So he compensated, and this served him later down the road. He compensated by being very verbal and assertive with his teachers. So he really learned how to use his intellect to manipulate and appear confident, despite all of these really social, awkward, and insecure things about himself. So this would really play out and be apparent over 25 years later when he chooses to represent himself in court, which we'll talk about, obviously, down the road.
We think his peers...
I think he only had like one or two friends. I think his peers were like, this is just kind of a wallflower, sort of weird guy who doesn't, kind of keeps to himself. He's really, but I guess in class, he was very outspoken and direct and assertive with his teachers, which does not surprise me. He was probably charming, but then also got away with what he wanted and challenged them. Even with all of these alleged burglaries and violence, to the outside world, other than the stuff with the girls and the awkwardness, to the outside world, as he started to get older, he actually appeared very well adjusted and bright. And in 1968, which would have made him, I think, in his early 20s, which we're gonna get into his college life here, he attended the Republican National Convention in Miami as a Nelson Rockefeller delegate.
The theme we've sort of been striking at is this identity issue, and him sort of playing at different identities and playing at who he was, and it's eventually when we get to the piece where he begins killing people that we are sure that he killed, that he may have finally found his identity and then got attached to that.
Yeah, it's a good way to look at that. All right, so moving on to his college life. So now we're looking at maybe 19, 20, 21, 1967. So that would have made him 21. He enters into an Asian studies program at the University of Washington. Interesting. I don't know why.
Well, and it's also interesting that he's 21 when he goes to college.
I mean, I don't know if he did anything before that. I know this is when, I believe this is when he seriously started.
Yeah, it's just interesting, right? Because most of us, if we go right from high school to college, we go at 18.
So especially at that time, there was, there weren't all the things that people do now before they go.
Because he wouldn't have gone to the military
right,
or
didn't.
anything.
So the personality piece, it was at this time he started another personality, in which he actually started becoming more confident, not just in class, which we knew he was doing that in high school, but also witty and secure with women. So he tried on this new mask, and he met a woman by the name of Diane Edwards. If you look up Diane Edwards, she also went by the pseudonym Stephanie Brooks. I don't know why. I don't think that's really that relevant, but Stephanie Brooks is going to be one of the most important factors of the rest of his killing spree, because she is the woman who breaks his heart, and every victim looks just like her.
Okay.
He meets this woman. This would be the woman who would literally paint the profile. Okay, so long brown hair, parted in the middle, very beautiful. She was very wealthy. I think that he felt, one, it was the first time he was in an intimate relationship, that he felt inadequate and insecure with someone the entire time, because
Mm-hmm.
as much as, and like we know about narcissism, is what they fall in love with you, quote unquote, in love with you for, is what they end up sort of hating you for at the same time. They want that from
Mm-hmm.
you, but they also don't want you to be better than them. And so I think that he really struggled with how he felt in that relationship, but he was obsessed with her. So to whatever capacity he was capable of falling in love, he did fall in love with Stephanie. It was his first intimate sexual relationship with a woman. It lasted a year until Stephanie broke it off. She was like, Bundy was not mature enough. She didn't feel he was going anywhere in his life. Well,
Very
depending
true.
on what you see as success, he did go somewhere in his life, but
Yes.
not. She was basically like, this is really just a college sweetheart kind of thing. And this, talk about an injury, right? I mean, he did not accept this, and he was devastated, and he was obsessed with her to the point where he actually dropped out of school and he moved back home.
I hear the shame in that, right? That she shamed him. He probably put her on a pedestal as, the perfect woman, and also as a narcissist by this point. I think we're saying, falling in love with yourself, your projected self, and falling in love with the mirror, like what you want to be, and being obsessed with that, of course. Not that other person, not that she was an actual human being with thoughts and feelings in her own life, but that she was an extension of himself. And then in essence being rejected inside, the shame inside would mirror totally his whole life, his, including the way he was born,
That's
in
right.
shame. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So, I mean, she really just exposed all the weakness, all the, everything that he seemed to see as inadequate. She really unmasked him there, I think. And it really, really did, it did an injury. Totally stripped him because he was relying on her, as you said, to, make him feel amazing. And she was a part of that. And when she said, no, I'm not, he crumbled. So he drops out of school. He goes home. At some point after he gets home, remember I was saying back at the age of 10, he started questioning whether or not his identity was what it was. He decides to go to City at this time to look into his family. And he had always suspected something. So while researching, he digs up the truth, and he finds that his sister was his mother, and he was an illegitimate child. He's been faced by betrayal by two women. It is believed that the betrayal and rejection was the ultimate trigger, that his killings were actually revenge killings. That this is what really triggered what we already know was that seed that had been planted early on in life. As mental health professionals, we know that there's that someone can be predisposed to something, but unless the environment triggers it, it may never be triggered. And a lot of theorists state that this was the ultimate trigger. Like, fuck this. Mother and the one woman he loved. So following these injuries, he goes back to the University of Washington in 1971. So we're looking at 4 years later, and he starts to study psychology. And he actually received a degree in it. I think it's the only thing he ever actually completed. He meets a new woman by the name of Elizabeth Kendall, who will become a witness at some point. She's a divorcee. They're dating, I think, for a couple of years. He starts to work on a suicide crisis hotline. So this is where he meets Ann Rule, who I was talking about earlier, who would work the graveyard shift with him. So she never suspected anything. He was always just really kind of looked at her as a mother figure or as an aunt. There was never a sexual thing. She was a bit older.
Which is lucky, right? Because whoever he attaches a sexuality
is
to
dead.
Is sort of, that's
right.
A
and
victim,
so
right?
She didn't resemble any of the victims anyway. But so she became a well-known writer, author, and she would become one of the most influential people in his life. Anne wouldn't suspect anything until years later, when Ted started to sort of fit the profile for many of the murders across the country. Even when he started to become a suspect, she would call him and say, Ted, I'm worried about you. I'm really worried about you. Like, you're sort of matching this profile. And he's like, oh, Anne, it's not that. And I'm totally fine. And so she wrote a book years later called The Stranger Beside Me that talks about and literally geographically locates him, and writes. A lot of women write in and say, I was here at this time and I think I had a run-in, and she would be able to say that was likely him or that wasn't. Really good book.
Fascinating. I was going to say, so for people who are looking to research more and are interested.
Not just writing on facts, she had personal experience and knew him all the way till the end, and was actually there at his execution. So, and she had a heart for him, but also started to feel very deceived and betrayed when she found out who he really was at the same time. So she tried to support him as much as she could, but, hello, he's a serial killer. So
ability to choose friends.
Absolutely.
Basically.
So in 1974, he then, after gets the degree in psychology, this is where he enrolls in the University of Utah to study law. A lot of people believe this is sort of a ruse to make him look smart, because we don't know if he ever really had an intention to finish. And he never did finish. But his law skills were the cause of his key grandiose decision to represent himself on trial for murder. He let go all of his, I'm the smartest person in the room, I've got this. In that spring, so he lasted all of 7 months, he drops out of law school, becomes involved in active politics. This time, young women begin to disappear across the Pacific Northwest. He becomes a rising Republican star. 7 women are now missing. And some of the theories behind this is he believed he was gathering information to outsmart the law, and he was really just a con artist. After this, all of his killings start.
Yeah, it's just so chilling, because you just see the ramp up, right? You just see all of the signs that we know. You see the childhood where the triad behavior, right? The animals and the different things that he did that we know about psychopathic behavior. And then the teenage years, all of the acting out and the sort of trying on the different identities. And then the college years where he actually starts to come into that narcissism and starts to figure out who he is, who he wants to be, the identity he thinks he has. And I'm sure all along the way, he's having all kinds of very terrifying, chaotic, and inside of him, just chaos and misunderstanding of the world, and not being able to relate, and trying to figure out how to attach and relate and figure out life. And he just wouldn't be able to do any of that. He wouldn't be capable of doing any of that. And then getting a degree in psychology, which, as we know, provides you with some cursory information. A bachelor's in psychology is sort of like the beginning. It's, I don't know, for a personality like this, more danger than it's worth to have a little bit of information, but not a lot.
That's right. And, and for people who don't know this, there's a reason why psychopaths are never treated in therapy, because they actually get worse. And they learn and they pick up and they mimic and they use that information to manipulate. And that is what I believe he was doing, is he was gathering a lot of information through these early years.
And I think in an effort to understand, back to when he was 3 with the knives, in an effort to understand humanity, which is not something he gets, he doesn't get it. And he wants to get it. He wants to figure it out. Okay, well, psychology, I can figure out what make people tick, and then it also serves the fact that I can then manipulate them.
It's so bone-chilling.
And hurt them, and it very much is. And the law school thing, I'm surprised he lasted 7 months, because the amount of, challenging behavior he would have come up across, they would have been challenging his thoughts and ideas and arguing with him and forcing him to defend himself. I mean, that would never fly with a
I'm almost wondering, though, if he saw some of these law professors almost not identically, but with Simon, his grandfather, was there, this admiration of, at some point, he's not going to be able to hold it together anymore, and hence the 7 months. But I know a lot of attorneys that have made it through law school as narcissists, and they've made it through, and they know how to placate,
Absolutely.
and they know how to feed someone's ego, and they know how to use people. If you think about it, he knew he needed these people to get this information. So even if that meant stuffing some shit down for a while, he knew that, they can get through this stuff if they're going to gain something through it. And I feel like he knew that he was going to gain something through it. So he was able to probably placate and charm the hell out of and use these professors for what he needed to at that time.
You bet, I'm sure. This is where we will conclude the first episode of this trilogy. What can we expect next
So the
time,
next
Kathy?
time, we are actually going to go through the trajectory of his killings, at least the ones we know. And we're going to look at different patterns. We're going to look at profiles of some of the victims. We're just going to kind of look at his style as a murderer and what he would do and the things that would trigger him and the methods he used. And we're even going to talk about how he was arrested several times before he was even accused of some of the more like mass killings, and how he was able to, quote unquote, get out of these situations. So further looking at his manipulation, his charm, how he was able to use that even to get out of some of the most notorious killings. Really interesting stuff. I don't know if anyone else could have pulled this off.
Right. So the killing years, in essence. Yeah. Well, thank you so much,
Yeah.
Dr. Barrett. We look forward to this.
All right.